Great, well, welcome everyone. Delighted to have you with us. My name is Katie Cannon. I'm the Curator of Education at the DAR Museum. Now, if you're not familiar with the museum, it was founded by the Daughters of the American Revolution to further their missions of historic preservation and education. The collection contains objects found in American houses from mostly the 1700s and 1800s. We have a number of virtual events going on, including a new tour for the month of March only that focuses on objects of the museum's collection that were made by women. Today, we'll be focusing on the women of Louisiana. So let me introduce our speaker. William Strollo is the Curator of Exhibitions for the Daughters of the American Revolution Museum, where he is responsible for the museum's collection of art, toys, prints, numismatics, and medals. William studied history at Virginia Commonwealth University and has participated in the Addingham Summer School and the Museum of Early Southern Decorative Arts Summer Institute. Previously, William has worked at Wilton House Museum in Richmond, Virginia, and for Colonial Williamsburg. So welcome, William.
Thank you very much, Katie. All right, let's go ahead and pull this up. All right. When the DAR headquarters was built at the beginning of the 20th century, the room that today is the Louisiana Period Room was a workroom. Historic images of the room show the workers posing in this space. In the 1950s, the workroom, like many of the rooms above, was converted into a period room. However, this room was not like any of its counterparts. This room was actually an outdoor space. The workroom became a 19th century Louisiana courtyard, more specifically a 19th century New Orleans courtyard. This courtyard, however, lacked one thing that most period rooms have an abundance of: objects. The only objects in this room at the time of this change was a set of iron courtyard furniture, benches and seats. It also had things that other period rooms lacked, such as a staircase to nowhere and a fountain. While there's nothing quite like having an outdoor New Orleans courtyard indoors, the 1980s brought another transition to the room. This was the first step toward making the room a true gallery. The few things that remain in this room during that phase of its life show more display cases for small objects. The number of objects acquired in the late 1970s and 1980s indicate that the Society and Museum were working on bolstering the interpretation for this room. The interpretation lasted about a decade before the Louisiana chapter of the DAR decided to focus the interpretation of the room on the roles and influences of women in Louisiana. This shift began in 1995 and is the basis for how the room is interpreted today. These daughters, along with one of the museum's curators at the time, started to shine some light on the important roles women played in shaping the state's history, as well as highlight decorative arts pieces from Louisiana. Working with members of the Louisiana DAR over the past couple of years, we have since strengthened the interpretation by discussing not only how women contributed to the colony and state in general, but also specific examples of how women of different backgrounds shaped the Pelican State. Using objects from or associated with the state, we can start to make connections to some of the pivotal women in the state. Today, I want to talk about some of the women we discuss in the current Louisiana Period Room interpretation. Through their cultural, activist, and equal rights influences, these women helped shape the identity of Louisiana and change the lives of their fellow citizens. We've broken the Louisiana Room up into different categories. And today we're going to focus on one of those categories. Today we'll talk about economy and commerce in Louisiana. It's here that we look generally at and acknowledge the roles women played in managing and shaping finances and how they were able to be agents of their own change through economic dealings. Take, for example, the resilient and savvy Michaela Olmenster, also known as the Baroness Pontalba. Michaela's life would go from sole heiress to abused wife to successful businesswoman in what could only be described as one of the most insane personal roller coasters. Born in 1795 in New Orleans, the only daughter of a wealthy philanthropist, Don Andreas Olmenster, Michaela was destined to live a life of leisure. After her father died when he was 70 and she was 3, her mother managed their estate and even helped to negotiate Michaela's marriage contract a decade later. It is there that this story really begins. The 15-year-old Michaela married 20-year-old Celestine, the future Baron Pontalba, in a traditional ceremony at the same St. Louis Cathedral in New Orleans that her father built and in which he is buried. The service was in Spanish, which neither of them understood since they both spoke French. After the wedding, the newlyweds and their mothers sailed for France. Celestine had promised to show Michaela all around Paris. However, the happily ever after part of this marriage never really came. Upon arriving in France, the two families made their way to the Pontalba Chateau, 50 miles outside of Paris. It was there, and not until well after the I do's, that Celestine and his father, Joseph Xavier Delfou, Baron Pontalba, found out that the marriage contract was not to his liking. You see, the Baron initiated this marriage conversation with Michaela's mother and expected that the marriage would be more of a business transaction and not so much a mutual marriage. However, according to the contract, Michaela and her mother retained much of the rights to her fortune, and the Pontalbas received a smaller yet still sizable dowry. This enraged the Baron. For years, he attempted to renegotiate the contract. He used every tool at hand to try and leverage more money from his new daughter-in-law. He even went to the extreme of not letting Michaela see her mother or speak to any of her household staff, even during her pregnancy and the birth of her first son. Though kept apart, Michaela's mother continued to look out for her daughter's future. She did so by purchasing rental properties throughout Paris. These lucrative investments would come in handy down the road as they would serve as Michaela's revenue for years to come. This had further benefits as Michaela's isolation wore on her, to the point that her mother agreed to increase the dowry to the Baron, derived from an entire block of the Palace d'Armes, or what today is Jackson Square in New Orleans. Despite how the Baron treated his daughter-in-law, Michaela's feelings for her husband remained strong. She traveled with him and remained by his side out of love. She knew that Celestine could be more caring and affectionate, if not close to his parents. But despite her best efforts, she could not keep him away from the Pontalbas. Michaela suffered a setback in 1825 when her mother, her only protector and supporter, died. Within days of the mother's death, the Pontalbas were again after her inheritance, seeking to make her life ever more miserable, using every legal means available to them. They fought to pry more money away from the wealthy heiress. And after weeks of trying, Michaela relented and turned over the other block of the Palace d'Armes in New Orleans, as well as hundreds of acres of land near the Bayou Road, none of which the Pontalbas were truly entitled to. In return, Celestine allowed his wife to collect the rent on the Paris properties her mother once owned. And I should note that this is a later image of Jackson Square, or the Palace d'Armes, the buildings on either side. You can see one of them highlighted here in red. Those are later structures built, and we'll actually talk about those here shortly. For years, Michaela attempted to take every legal action she could to divorce from her husband, but the French laws at the time made it too difficult for her to leave him. However, in 1830, and without any warning to her husband, Michaela fled France and returned to New Orleans. There, she started recollecting the rent on the Palace d'Armes properties that were rightfully hers. She took a tour of the ever-growing United States, making stops in Niagara Falls, New York City, Philadelphia, Washington, Florida, and even to Havana, Cuba. Throughout this trip, a now happier Michaela was accompanied by a Francois Guillaumin, French counselor to Cuba, in Cuba. It's not clear if this meeting was by design or happenstance, but in letters sent to her aunt in New Orleans, Michaela expressed the joy and happiness she now felt on this journey. Details of this borderline, quote, criminal liaison are hard to read in her letters, but she was now happy being an ocean away from her abusive in-laws. Upon returning to New Orleans, Michaela was greeted with a legal verdict from France that she had deserted her husband and that she was required to return or face imprisonment. The judgment required her to remain with her husband for at least 6 months in order to avoid that jail time and lose all her financial assets. Thus, in 1834, she returned to Pontalba Chateau and was welcomed with a new set of rules to follow that were even more demoralizing than what she had already been through. Now she was no longer allowed to speak to any members of the staff, family, or guests in the house. She lived in a guest house near the main house, yet dined at the family table where she was not allowed to speak. Anyone caught talking to her would immediately be asked to leave. And try as she must to speak to her own husband, the Baron made sure he was never alone with her. After some time, she was allowed to live in one of the Paris properties she owned. This gave her a little more freedom and distance from her husband and his controlling parents. Yet during this time, Michaela still endeavored to make amends with her husband. That was the purpose behind her fateful journey back to the family chateau on October 19th, 1834. That evening, Michaela was with her husband attempting to find some common ground in order to better their marriage when her father-in-law burst into the room carrying 2 loaded dueling pistols. Fed up with his daughter-in-law, the Baron charged in with the intention of shooting her. The heated exchange ended with Michaela being shot 4 times while trying to flee through the halls of the chateau. She lost 2 fingers on her right hand, her left breast was disfigured, and she lived the rest of her days with a collapsed lung. After shooting her, the Baron returned to his study, where he finalized his will before taking his own life with one of the same pistols. With his father's death, Celestine became the new Baron and Michaela the Baroness. However, their marriage would still remain fractured. Despite her wounds and sufferings, the French court refused to let them separate. That is, until Celestine made one fatal mistake. Following Michaela's most recent attempt for a separation, her husband published and distributed excerpts of the trial. The only part he published, however, were those that slandered his wife, giving her just what she needed to take him to court again. This time, she was successful and finally granted her separation. Her newfound freedom returned to her everything that was rightfully hers. Every part of her inheritance that was manipulated away from her over the years was returned to her. And with this new financial freedom, the Baroness finally got to work on what she truly loved, architecture. She began working on what was described at the time as the largest private residence in Paris, the Hotel Pontalba. This residence, which she helped to design, included elements salvaged from another house in Paris, and the drawing and construction was overseen by L.T.J. Visconti, an architect who at the time was mainly known for his fountain designs. Michaela's involvement was much more hands-on from the start. Through the building process, even at the foundational level, Michaela caught various construction and design flaws: inferior soft stones, misaligned elevations, fireplaces in rooms where they didn't need them, and no fireplaces where they were more necessary. Even each mistake she caught, she also found a solution to. Today, the Hotel Pontaba is the residence of the US ambassador to France. Michaela brought that same devotion and drive to New Orleans in 1849 when she began a full-scale renovation on Jackson Square. The main part of this project being the buildings on the main part of this project being the building of what are today the Pontaba buildings on either side of the square. These two red brick buildings combine Greek Revival, French, Spanish, and Creole styles. With plans in hand upon arrival in New Orleans, the Baroness hired Samuel Stewart to help oversee the project. Michaela's hands were all over these buildings, from the overall design to the finite details, such as the mantels, rails, and locks. Michaela was an astute architect with no formal training. She even timed the opening of the building for opera singer Ginny Lind, who we see here, her month-long stay in New Orleans, offering the star soprano a residence during her stay. Michaela left New Orleans for the last time in 1851 before the yellow fever season in order to attend to family business back in France. Waiting for her on the other side of the ocean was Celestine, the Baron Pontaba. The Baroness remained in France for the rest of her life, caring for her estranged husband and his estate until her death in 1874, at the age of 79. Despite never returning to New Orleans, the Baroness's touch was left on the heart of the city through her astute architectural design of this now iconic square. The Baroness's compassion, dedication, fortitude, and goodwill are her true legacy. The designs she oversaw give us the insight to how committed she was to whatever she took on, no matter how difficult or harrowing the road ahead. Another figure who spent some time in New Orleans and turned her life around through successful financial management was Catherine Willis Murat, also known as Princess Murat. We got a little royalty thing going on here. Born in Fredericksburg, Virginia, Catherine Dangerfield Willis was born in 1803 to Colonel Bird Charles Willis and Mary Lewis. Mary is the granddaughter of Fielding Lewis, who is the brother-in-law of George Washington. Catherine first married Atkinson Gray, son of John Gray of Travelers Rest, in present-day Kearneysville, West Virginia, in 1818. However, Atkinson died the following year. In 1825, Catherine was living in Florida with her parents and 5 siblings. The following year, she met Prince Charles Louis Napoleon Achille Murat, the son of the former king of Naples. Achille was born into the notable Bonaparte family at a time when they were really making a name for themselves. Achilles' uncle was Napoleon Bonaparte, and his father, Joachim, who was appointed King of Naples during the First French Empire. After his father was executed by his own subjects, Achilles was exiled in Austria with his mother and siblings. And Achilles here is the one in the uniform holding his mother's hand. In 1821, the prince left Europe for America, landing first in New York and later traveling to Washington, D.C. It was there that he met the territorial delegate for Florida, who persuaded him to buy land and settle in the newly acquired territory. By the time he met Catherine in 1826, he had already purchased at least 2 tracts of land, totaling roughly 3,700 acres. Catherine and Achilles met in 1826, and by July of that year were married. Much of their next 21 years together were dominated by Achilles' various political, military, and financial endeavors. The Prince Murat fought in the Seminole Wars, dueled a neighbor with different political opinions, befriended Ralph Waldo Emerson, and returned to Europe in hopes of regaining some of his family's established fortunes. After his failed trip to Europe, things appeared to, After his failed trip to Europe, things appear to start heading south. In 1835, the Murats moved to New Orleans, where the prince practiced law and owned a sugar plantation outside of the city. Their ventures in Louisiana did not last long, and they were forced to return to their estate in Florida. In 1839, they could no longer afford their Lapona plantation and were forced to sell it. They were forced to move to a smaller plantation in present-day Jefferson County, Florida, where they resided until Achilles died in 1847. Now on her own, not having any children, Catherine was left with her husband's mountain of debt and an estate to manage on her own. Over the next few years, Catherine used what property remained to turn these finances around. She proved to be a very efficient and thus profitable manager of the family's plantation. And it took her significantly less time to dig herself out of debt than it took for her husband to get them there in the first place. In 1854, she purchased an even smaller estate, Bellevue, outside of Tallahassee. Catherine would remain here until her death in 1867. You can visit the house today at the Tallahassee Museum and learn more about how Catherine and the 25 enslaved people who worked the cotton fields, and learn more about the 25 enslaved people who worked the cotton fields that supported her estate. Shortly after she purchased this house and land, she was appointed to be the first vice regent for Florida to another notable organization, the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. Working alongside Ellen Call Long, the daughter of Florida's former territorial governor, they raised money to preserve George Washington's Mount Vernon. Shortly before her death, at the age of 63, Catherine received an annuity from the French government after her financial losses following the Civil War. Catherine was offered the opportunity to move to France, but by Louis Napoleon with other Murat and Bonaparte exiles. She declined and remained at Bellevue until she died on August 6, 1867. Both Princess Murat and the Baroness Bontaba were truly remarkable and resilient women of their time period. And now, one final person I want to focus on today is Eliza Jane Nicholson, also known as Pearl Rivers, the first female newspaper publisher in the South. Nicholson's life will show us how she was able to improve a publication with the inclusion of more female contributors through modernization and good business practices. Born in Mississippi in 1843, Eliza was the third of 8 children and lived with her aunt for years as her mother suffered from poor health. She remained with her aunt and uncle throughout her childhood, acting as their only child, and began writing young. It was not long before she was sent to attend the Amite Female Seminary in Liberty, Mississippi. She graduated in 1859 and remained with her aunt and uncle until after the Civil War. In the years after the war, Eliza had a number of suitors express interest in marriage, but she did not find any of them to her liking. So instead of marriage, Eliza left the country for a chance at a paid career in writing in the city. In 1867, she sent a poem to John Overall, editor of The South, who gave her encouragement and feedback on style, which gave her the motivation to seek publication elsewhere. That's when she adopted the pseudonym Pearl Rivers, after the tributary on which her adopted family's lumber business resided. Her first poem was published in the Picayune in 1868. After After this, she became a regular contributor to the paper. She even wrote on life in rural Mississippi and had poems published in the New Orleans Times. It was at this point that Eliza decided to leave home for a chance to establish a career in New Orleans. She left Mississippi to live with her maternal grandfather, who had moved to the city before the recent Civil War. And it was her grandfather that introduced her to many of the city's important people, including Colonel Alva Morris Holbrook, the publisher of the Picayune. Holbrook, who had already published her poems in his paper, hired Eliza to be the paper's literary editor, a job that paid $25 a week. Eliza had already broken her first barrier. She was now the first female editor in the city. This was a brave role to accept, as the paper business in the 19th century was seen largely as a man's domain. The young Eliza quickly made a name for herself. Her poems were published regularly in the paper, and she had gained a reputation within the publication for her hard work. The latter has been partly attributed to her lack of social life due to the then taboo nature of having a paid job in the newspaper. Nonetheless, Eliza did garner the attention of one person in particular, her boss, Alva Holbrook. Mr. Holbrook, a 63-year-old married man, had been unhappy for years in his marriage to his wife, Jenny, who was known to be violently unstable. In November 1871, the Holbrooks filed for divorce and were granted their permanent separation in January 1872. Alva quickly turned around and proposed to the 29-year-old Eliza, who he married in May 1872 at her grandfather's house. Alva and Eliza, who was now going by her assumed name, Pearl Rivers, divested their interests in the paper and moved uptown, where she worked on a collection of poems for publication. It was during this period that Alva's former wife came after his new wife with a revolver while at home working on her book. If not for the courage of the Holbrooks maid, Eliza may not have escaped with the few scrapes that she did. And despite all the attention the newlyweds attracted with their quick marriage and related drama, Eliza was able to publish her poems through a publisher in Philadelphia. Yet economic hardships hit the country and the Holbrooks the following year, and in 1875, Alva purchased back the newspaper and was prepared to start making improvements when he suddenly died, leaving the entire estate to his wife. And while the paper was swamped with debt, Pearl, as she was now widely known, took control of the publication, determined not to let it fail. With the help from the paper's business manager, George Nicholson, Pearl and the Picayune began the hard work of investing in and improving upon the paper. Pearl quickly gained the admiration of the paper's staff, at least those who stuck around and were not afraid of working for a woman. In fact, her chief editorial writer visited every newspaper's office to warn them against any negative press about a female editor, as was the case with one local publication. She also attracted the attention of yet another suitor, George Nicholson. Nicholson's wife died of a long illness in 1877, and shortly after this, the friendship between Pearl and Nicholson turned to affection, and in 1878, the two were married at St. Paul's Episcopal Church. He was 58 and she was 35. The newlyweds were dedicated to one another and the paper. Each day they went into work together. They continued to publish the paper even through the hardship of yet another yellow fever epidemic, which took the lives of over 4,000 of New Orleans' residents. They improved the paper by expanding its content to include more poems and highlight notable national writers such as Mark Twain. The paper featured more illustrations and promoted editorials for a stronger public education, improved public works, and honest government. The paper also began to hire more female writers, like Martha Smallwood Fields and Elizabeth Meriwether Gilmer, both of whom went on to write columns that were picked up around the country. These women and all of those that worked for Pearl admired her, not just for her determination and success, but also because she paid them what they deserved. She paid her female and male writers equally. Pearl regularly made improvements to the paper and the building to stay ahead of the curve, remaining relevant and competitive. This became evident as competitors were forced to merge in order to stay afloat, and readership in the city and further out increasingly grew. The Picayune soon began publishing the latest pieces from the newly formed Associated Press, which came in on the Telegraph regularly. Over the years and after giving birth to 2 sons, Pearl slowly transitioned out of the direct daily running of the paper. She and George finally built a home in New Orleans and eventually a second in Mississippi, just 2 hours from the newspaper, where they would spend more and more of their time. Pearl would receive manuscripts and letters from the paper daily by way of the train. After a flood in 1893 washed away their Mississippi home, the family moved back to New Orleans. They remained there for the rest of their lives. George died in February of 1893, and Pearl just 11 days later, both of the flu. The remarkable Eliza Jane Nicholson, the first female newspaper publisher in the South, had what it took to turn the Picayune around and provide for what the people of New Orleans and Louisiana wanted in their paper. By elevating female writers and paying them equally, Eliza proved that she was ahead of her time. Now, these are just some of the amazing stories of successful, fierce, determined, and compassionate women in the long history of Louisiana. We could easily talk about the devotion and care that exemplified in the Ursuline nuns, or the dedication to education that women like Eleanor McMain or Henrietta Delisle exemplified, or even how Cleoma Falcon brought the first recording of Cajun music to the nation. Many remarkable women hail from Louisiana, and I'm excited to be working on incorporating their stories into the DAR's Louisiana Gallery. Thank you. All right. I am happy to take questions now. And let's see. If you have a question, go ahead and put it in the Q&A section down below. We will get to your questions. I've got a few coming in here. The first one is from Elizabeth. She says, I found it interesting in the photo of the Picayune that Eliza Pearl is listed as Mrs. E.J. Nicholson, not Mrs. George Nicholson, as has usually been the way for women were identified. And in what I was able to find, she actually changes the masthead a couple of times to reflect first her name as being Pearl Rivers as the publisher, and then eventually Mrs. E.J. Nicholson. So she keeps part of her first name, and then eventually I think she does change it to Mrs. George Nicholson. I gotta thank you. You're welcome. Thank you for your kind comments, everyone. Why isn't there more about her? We'd like to know which her there is. you're speaking of. There's actually, you can go to a few sites. The Historic New Orleans collection, if you want to learn more about these ladies and more, like some of the ones I mentioned at the end, and that's that last slide. The Historic New Orleans collection had an exhibition years ago that featured many women from the 19th, early 20th centuries, even up to, I think, the early 2000s. Prominent women in New Orleans. And that's a great exhibition that's now online. You can go there. That's the Historic New Orleans collection. There's also a publication out there called Louisiana. Oh, I had a copy of it here and now it's gone. Louisiana Women. And it gives you lots of great stories about women throughout Louisiana, all the way up into the 20th century, through the 20th century, that highlights some of the great work being done in various fields, such as education, suffrage, the architecture we talked about, Baroness Metabo publication. So there are plenty of great resources out there. Someone asking here more about the Louisiana Gallery. Where is it? What is it? So the Louisiana Gallery at the DAR is located in the lower level. So when you are able to come back, and we look forward to hopefully inviting everyone back later this year, if you were to head down to the lower level of the of Memorial Continental Hall, the main building at that is the DAR headquarters. You'll go downstairs and to the end of the Yoakum Gallery, which is a long white gallery. It features objects from our permanent collection. At the end of the hall is the Louisiana Gallery. And as I mentioned early on in the presentation, it had started off as a workroom when the building was first built, and eventually transitioned into a courtyard, and then and now what today is a gallery. And in this gallery, we feature pieces of furniture that are objects from Louisiana or have Louisiana connections, or French or Spanish connections, that are able to allow us to jump into conversations about the roles that women played in Louisiana. So Louisiana Gallery really focuses on the roles generally and specifically that women played in Louisiana during the as early as the 17th up to the mid 19th century. Down. Glad to hear. Oh, Fredericksburg is your hometown. That's actually where I'm presenting from today, so it's a great place. Let's see. Thank you, thank you. You give us a tour of property. Can we view this presentation later as well? Yes, you'll be able to view this presentation later. You'll be able to find it on our YouTube page. So I would encourage you to go back to our YouTube page probably in the next day or so. I'll let Katie maybe speak to that or put a comment out there, but usually it's in a few days we'll have this presentation uploaded to our YouTube page. The first lady, that would be Michaela. Where was her father when she was dealing with her husband's family? You only mentioned her mother. Her father had died when she was 3 years old. So, you know, and then she married when she was 15, 12 years later. So he unfortunately had passed away when she was very young. So he was not there to help deal. But I think what's very interesting about her life is that it's not just her, it's not just Michaela who is taking charge of her own life, trying to do her thing, trying to fight for herself and fight for her marriage, but it's also her mother, Michaela's mother, who is serving as her biggest supporter, Michaela's biggest supporter, her biggest advocate. She's buying all these properties. She's thinking ahead so that Michaela has her own income so that she can sustain herself and not rely on the Pontavas, on her in-laws for her livelihood. So I think it's very interesting. I think that story is not just her story, it is their story because it is so much a together story. And yes, if you look in the chat, Katie just posted there, you'll see that the recording will be uploaded to the YouTube channel. All right, I think we've gotten to most all of our questions. Looking forward to adding the stories. Thank you so much. All right. All right, well, yeah, I think that's going to be it for us today. If you are interested in more about more programs for the DAR, more lectures, I would encourage you to go over to our website. That would be dar.org/museum to find out more. You can also always email the museum, which is museum@dar.org, to get information about any of the other upcoming programs. So thank you all for joining today, and I hope you enjoyed it.